back. I'm glad to have you with us. This is another episode of Wednesday Night Live, and we're very happy to have you. We've got a couple things to discuss tonight. One of them is the news right now about the young pilot who was burned alive, and we're going to talk about that because this is something that we see it in all of its incredible violence and evil. But we're going to talk about how this is okay if you are a true follower of Islam. But before we do that, as we do every week at this time, let me first tell you about Compassion and Hope Pregnancy Center. Compassion and Hope Pregnancy Center is a Christ-centered nonprofit ministry offering life-affirming alternatives to abortion and compassionate care to those who face pregnancy and abortion-related issues. Now, you probably wonder, Ralph, why do you start off every week with that same message? Because I don't want you to forget about these people. They are a small organization. They are doing, and I don't say this lightly, they are doing God's work. Their intent is to save babies, not to cause them to not exist. Can't even think of words I want to. I'm a little distracted because I was reading some of the Hadith, which is the Muslim holy book. At any rate, I digress. Forgive me. Compassion and Hope Pregnancy Center is a small organization. They have one paid staff, and they're very dedicated, but they need your help, financially and otherwise. So won't you please call 478-HOPE, that's area code 208-478-HOPE, and see if you can't help them. You may wish to make a monthly contribution. It doesn't have to be big, but if it's consistent, every little bit helps. They don't get the millions of tax dollars like the Planned Parenthood people who are planning our parenthood down to the promotion of homosexuality to prevent birth, and that's a fact. You can read it in their own publications. You'll have to dig for it. They don't put it out front. They don't want you to know they support homosexuality and the lifestyle, but that's one of their birth control methods. Compassion and Hope Pregnancy Center is a Christian organization. Their message is about life. 478-HOPE. Well, I'm sorry I got off point there. But I'm going to get back to where I was, and that has to do. Have you seen this thing on television yet? I hope you didn't watch the whole thing. It's 22 minutes, I think it is. You certainly don't want to watch the last 3 minutes because, and I can tell you about it, but even the television people who are always looking for something sensational don't show the whole thing. Now they're not going to show you the whole 22 minutes anyway. That's half a program, but. They do show a still photo, and I've seen this on Fox, and I think it was on CNN, of this young Jordanian pilot, 26 years old, I think he was, who is caged. He is in a cage, literally in a cage like you might have one time seen in carnivals where a lion or some other captive animal is in. And these messengers of peace, of the followers of Allah, the Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, completely douse him in gasoline, and the cage, of course, is covered with gasoline. Then they run a trail of gasoline off to the side, and then they throw a torch on the trail and literally burn the man alive. Burn him alive. Now, we in the West look at this and we think, what kind of barbarians, what kind of base animals, what kind of non-humans would do such a thing? Now, if you've studied history, and most of us have at one point or some part of it, you know that these things happened when the Christians, so-called, they weren't truly Christians, but they were wearing that robe in the Middle Ages where they were burning people at the stake if they didn't become followers of Christ. That was not Christianity. But the Muslims and their detractors love to point this out and say, hey, you Christians are just as bad. For one thing, that was, 800 years ago, we kind of learned. Or they like to say, well, look at what happened with the Jews. And yes, there was a period in the growth of Judaism, and I'm not a big scholar on this, but if you go to the Tanakh, you go to the Pentateuch, however you like to do it, the first 5 books, and you study the history of the first 5 books of Scripture, there were times when God told his chosen people, the Jews, to slaughter entire towns. Yes, that happened 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, but this is 21st century. And yet we have these barbarians who would have us go back to the Dark Ages. They would put us back in the 7th century. And it's very interesting that they're quite capable of using all the modern technology to get their point across. They're very skilled at this, and yet they want to return the rest of us to the Dark Ages. And it's rather like looking at an extraordinarily perverse mafia. The mafia had its own problems, and many of them were perverse of itself. But it's like looking at a perverse mafia. You've got the Godfather and his his capos, and the regimes and all that. And then the rest of the guys are soldiers, and then just the regular people that are paying extortion and all that. That's what this modern day Islam is. Now, lest I get too far off track, let me just tell you, there are some 72 sects of Islam. They are, just like Christianity, they are diverse. Oh, I hate using that word, only because it's been so abused. But Islam is diverse, and I've shared with you about a doctor we had years ago in California who was from, for lack of a better term, the 72nd sect of Islam. And interestingly, he had a thing. I told you about this beautiful piece of art cut out of brass or some noble metal like that on the wall. Beautiful Arabic kind of, it looked kind of like a flame and all kinds of stuff. And I asked him about it, and it turns out it is a prayer, a Muslim prayer. And I don't know what part of the service or the prayer worship it is, but I asked him to read it to me. Well, he couldn't, because he didn't read that Arabic. He read Pashto, which is a form of Arabic, I guess, but he didn't read the classic Arabic. But this prayer was on his wall, just like many people who would call themselves Christians might put a crucifix or a cross on the wall, but they really don't practice it. It's just kind of a symbol. And I'm not gangster slapping anybody. I'm just making a point. But he remarked to me once about if he and I and any others were sitting in a room, and these Islamists, these nutcases, were going to kill people, they would kill him first before they killed me, because I am one of the people of the book. In the perverted ways of Islam, and when you start studying, you find out just how perverse it is, twisted, convoluted, weird. It does not fit the Western logic system at all. And if you look at the Quran, so much of it was taken from the Jews, so much of it was taken from the Christians, and then perverted. Where the prophet had these visions, and then he came up with the Quran. According to him, of course, he's the direct voice of God, or their God, which is theirs is Allah, not the Western God that you and I know. Well, getting back to this young man that was burned alive, you remember my telling you when, and I told you this a couple of months ago, that this whole phenomenon known as ISIS or ISIL or whatever cover that the Barry Sotero is using today to cover up for them. I told you these are fundamentalists. They have not hijacked anything. They are the purest form of fundamentalist Muslims. They are directly going by what Islam teaches in its purest form. Now, there have been some changes. There are people, the Muslim world is, depending on who's counting, 1.2 to 1.6 billion people. But it's not unlike the Christian world and the Jewish world in that many people call themselves Muslims who know very little about the faith. The interesting thing about it is they are commanded to do certain things and say that they do them because they're told to do it, because Allah told them through the Prophet Muhammad, and so they have no choice. They have to do them. You and I, if we are Christians, perhaps we live under grace. We are redeemed by our faith, so to speak, and we don't do them under compulsion, except that brought into us by the Holy Spirit, where we feel compelled to worship our God. Jews likewise. There are many aspects of it. So we have to be careful, although it appears that we've got this broad brushstroke of Islam. But going back to ISIS, this is the purest essence of the incredibly bizarre world of Islam in its pure form. Now, let's get to this young fellow that was immolated by Muslims. I was looking at, this is a book I've recommended to you before, Islam According to Muhammad, Not Your Neighbor. And this is by Dr. Stephen M. Kirby. And Stephen M. Kirby is a friend of mine. I've told you about him before, but he's also a very astute student of Islam. He is very versed in Islam. He's been writing about it. I think this is his third, maybe fourth book. But there's a chapter in here, Islam According to Muhammad, Not Your Neighbor, called Burning the Folks. I'm going to just read this to you. It's not too long, but it might give you a little understanding. It is not unusual to hear that Islam prohibits burning people to death because that is a punishment reserved only for Allah. Here is the hadith used to support this claim. Now, you may have known if you watch my program regularly, the hadith is second only in importance and authority to the Quran, and basically it supports and builds the Quran. All right, narrated by Abu Hurairah, Allah's messenger sent us in an expedition, that is an army unit, and said, if you find so-and-so and so-and-so, burn both of them with fire. When we intended to depart, Allah's messenger said, I have ordered you to burn, Allah's messenger is Muhammad, I have ordered you to burn so-and-so and so-and-so, and it is not but Allah who punishes with fire, so if you find them, kill them. And there's a similar story about a specific individual. As for Habar bin al-Aswad, indeed the messenger of God, whenever he sent out an expedition, commanded it regarding Habar, that if we were found, he should be burned in the fire. Or if he were found, he should be burned in the fire. Then he changed his mind, saying, surely only the Lord of hellfire should cause such suffering. Cut off his hands and his legs. If you have power over him, then kill him. So torture him, mutilate him, then kill him. However, there are specific incidents in which Muhammad actually ordered the burning down of occupied structures. In December 627, the Prophet launched a raid against the tribe of Al-Mustalak, and they fought back. So he commanded to set fire to their fortifications all night long, with the widespread knowledge that women and children were in there. Around June 628, when Kinana bin al-Rabi of the Jewish Bani al-Nadir tribe would not reveal where his conquered tribe's treasures were hidden, Muhammad ordered one of his soldiers, torture him until you extract what he has. So a fire was built on Kinana's chest until Kinana nearly died. While I'm reading this to you, those of you who are listening, if you are following the laws of Moses, compare this with Moses, and obviously Moses comes out quite a bit ahead. If you are a Christian, compare this with the teachings of Christ. There is no comparison. When did Jesus Christ ever say to burn somebody alive, to cut off their hands, to torture them? And yet Muhammad, alleged to be, by his own word, by his own definition, the prophet of Allah, the God of Islam, would have all these things, including burning people alive. In October 630, there was some resistance among the Muslims toward a military expedition Muhammad was planning against the Byzantines at Tabuk. Muhammad heard that the hypocrites were assembling in the house of Suwalim the Jew. His house was by Jasum, keeping men back from the apostle in the raid on Tabuk. So the Prophet sent Talib bin Ubadayallah with a number of his friends to them with orders to burn Suwalim's house down on them. Talib did so, and Al-Dahak bin Khalifa threw himself from the top of the house and broke his leg, and his friends rushed out and escaped. In June 632, after Muhammad's death, the attack on Ubna that he had earlier ordered took place. The leader of the Muslim force said, "The messenger of God commanded me, and this was his last command to me, to hasten the march and to raid them without inviting them to Islam and to destroy them." So, many times people were given a chance to convert or die. In this case, they were told, don't even invite them, just kill them. And burn and destroy and burn. And Muhammad even considered burning down Muslims' houses around them to compel their attendance at congregational prayers. It was narrated that Abu Hurairah said, "The messenger of Allah said, I was thinking of commanding that the call to prayer be given, and then I would tell a man to lead the people in prayer. Then I would go out with some other men carrying bundles of wood and go to the people who do not attend to prayer and burn their houses down around them." Did you ever hear of Christ saying, if you don't show up at the temple, you're to be burned alive? Neither did I. I don't remember Moses ever saying that. So Muhammad's statements and actions show that during his lifetime it was permissible to burn people, even Muslims, alive. This was continued after Muhammad's death. Now I share that with you because we have been shocked and just astonished by what we have seen by the ISIS burning this young pilot to death. But that's not new. It's only that they have decided to make it such a big deal because they know that it incenses the Western way of thinking, and they know it will cast fear into the hearts and minds of many that are in the area around Jordan, people in Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon. And so they do the most horrific things they can do. Now, I'm sure they enjoy it. You don't do these kinds of things. Only monsters can do this. And we've seen with their beheadings, we've seen with them eviscerating babies and cutting off their arms and heads. These are monsters. They have no feelings. They're less than amoeba in their capacity to reason. But they are very deadly. Well, we're going to. I've got a short film that gives you some, hopefully, give you some other understanding of. And let me digress again, as I often do when I'm talking to you. Why do I show you this week after week? It's not to incense you. It's not meant to inflame passions. It's meant to prepare you so that you better understand what Islam has in mind for the rest of the world. They are intent on a one-world caliphate. There will be one imam or caliph, and he will rule the rest of us. And he will do it because Islam tells him. And you have to understand that the Muslims, because they are taught this way through the Quran, supplemented by the Hadith and other books, they are taught that their religion is superior to all others. And all others deserve to die if they will not bow, if they will not submit. So, Josh, are we ready with that? Please watch this.
Though Islam is perhaps the central focus of world events today, the actual beliefs of what has often been called the world's fastest growing religion remain a mystery to many. Contrary to Western perceptions, Islam is not monolithic. Within Islam, there are many different sects, but all are united by some central ideas. First is the acceptance of the Quran as the revelation of Allah, or God, though interpretations of the Quran vary according to a number of factors.
This has led to a difference in emphases, in what traditions are accepted or rejected by particular groups, and hence it really becomes a matter of what tradition you give the most weight to as to how you read the Quran.
Dr. James White, the president of Alpha and Omega Ministries, has participated in numerous public debates with Muslim scholars.
They all have the Quran, but it's really the traditions that you bring to the Quran that determine how you're going to interpret it and how you're going to understand what it's actually stating.
Islam is not a theological system, it's a legal system. And so to know who you are, to know what to do, to know how to eat, where to live, how to travel, you always go back to Islamic law.
Ron George of World in Need has ministered to Muslims for nearly 40 years. He says guidance for daily living in Islam comes through another major book, the Hadith.
The heart of Islam is the Hadith. And the Hadith is a collection of 600,000 sayings that developed over a 200-year period. Now, between 650 and 850, various scholars traveled around the Muslim world, North Africa, Egypt, Palestine, Iraq, talking to people, collecting stories about what they understood Muhammad had said and what Muhammad had done. They collected these stories into a book called the Hadith. And if you take the complete collection, there is 600,000. Now, those stories tell you how to live your life.
Islam professes to accept the Bible as true in addition to the Quran, and has at times professed respect for Christians and Jews as people of the book.
Prophet Muhammad expected Jews and Christians to join his jihad or his faith because he declared that Islam believed in the same God of Abraham.
Dr. Walid Faris is one of the foremost authorities on Islam today.
The concept of people of the book means, or meant practically, that if you were Jewish or Christian at the time of the rise of Islam, you were considered better than pagan or follower of other religions. So you are people of the book. What we expect from you is to understand that we are now the leaders of that book religion, which is now the Quran.
I did a debate at Bible University against one of the leading Islamic apologists, Shabir Ali. And one of the questions I asked him during cross-examination, what of the New Testament is still inspired and how can we tell? And his answer was very clear. That which agrees with the Quran is inspired. That which doesn't is not.
Islam's prophet, Muhammad, lived about 600 years after Christ and claimed that his supposed revelations were the final word of God, succeeding everything else. So what are some of the chief theological differences between Islam and Christianity?
When a Christian looks at Islam, the structure of Islamic thought, the Quran, what the religion of Islam teaches about God and about how we may be acceptable to Him, one comes across an anti-gospel.
Dr. Albert Mohler is the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky.
Islam's understanding of God is not the understanding presented in the Scripture of the one true and living God. The doctrine of the Trinity is central and non-negotiable for Christianity. It is anathema to the Muslims. The way of salvation, according to the gospel, is to be justified by faith alone, through the work of Christ alone, and that given to us by grace alone. All of that is foreign to the conception of Islam.
Islam, like Christianity and Judaism, is a monotheistic religion. They believe there is only one God. However, the Bible reveals God as a Trinity, one God eternally existing as three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, thus making the concept of relationship inherent in God Himself. Islam, by contrast, teaches radical monism, with Allah being purely one in every sense.
When you are speaking to a Muslim and you are speaking of your faith in Christ, they think you're worshiping at least two gods, and you are inviting them to commit the greatest sin of idolatry. And so that creates a tremendous barrier to what we're trying to proclaim to the Islamic people.
Muhammad's denial that Christ is God's begotten Son was part of his denial of the Trinity. But many scholars believe that Muhammad labored under a misunderstanding of what the doctrine of the Trinity actually teaches.
Could Muhammad have thought that the doctrine of the Trinity was actually Allah, Jesus, and Mary? It seems very clear that is what he thought. And as such, it is a misrepresentation of Christian belief.
Indeed, the Quran in Surah 5:116 reads, quote, Allah will say, O Jesus, son of Mary, did you say to men, take me and my mother for two gods besides Allah? Unquote. Because of the radical oneness of the Islamic conception of God, many scholars have pointed out that Muslims find God virtually unapproachable. There is no concept of relationship with God as in Christianity, and no assurance of heaven except through martyrdom.
The result is that the individual Muslim, while he has read very often that Allah is merciful and oft-forgiving, he doesn't have any real grounds for knowing whether Allah is going to be merciful and oft-forgiving to him or to her, because there is no mediator. Allah is so transcendent, so far above His creation, that the very idea of entering into it in the incarnation, as Christians believe about Jesus Christ, is completely rejected and completely foreign to Islamic thought. And so the idea that God would actually make a way for me to have a relationship with Him, that I would actually be so important to Him, that He would make a way for me to know Him, and hence to know that I have peace with Him, to know that I am right with Him, totally foreign to Islamic thought.
So one of the problems that new believers have in the Muslim world is that they turn to you and say, now, what do I do? And you say, well, you don't have to do nothing. It's salvation by faith. It's a gift of God. Yes, but what do I do? How do I pray? How do I wash? Who can I marry? How do I divorce? What do I eat? What do I don't eat? They don't understand grace.
While professing high regard for Jesus as a prophet of God, Islam ultimately denies that He was God incarnate, that He died on the cross for sins, and that He is the mediator between God and men.
There is a verse in the Quran, Surah 4:157, that every Christian should know about. It is the one verse in all of the Quran that says that Jesus Christ did not die upon Calvary's cross. And most Muslims feel that that's one of the biggest stumbling blocks of the gospel for them, is that if Jesus died upon a cross, then he died as a blasphemer, and Allah would never allow one of his beloved prophets to die in that fashion, because they don't see that Jesus is doing this voluntarily, that he's doing this as a sacrifice. And so Surah 4:157 in essence says that it was made to appear that Jesus died upon a cross, but instead God raised him to himself. And so the Muslim doesn't understand why we are so focused upon the cross. The Muslim is very much like the Jew of the day of Paul. Because remember, Paul, when he describes the cross, what is it? It is a scandalon. It is a stumbling block to the Jew. Because for them, the Messiah was to be this tremendous victor, not one who dies in such a fashion at the hands of the Romans. So that was a stumbling block to them. And to the Greeks, moranos, foolishness. How could the Creator enter into his own creation and die in such a fashion?
While Christianity begins with an internal change of heart called regeneration, in Islam one is considered Muslim after outwardly professing faith to Allah and to Muhammad as his prophet, followed by submission to the Islamic laws called Sharia. This is why forced conversions have been considered valid in the Islamic world.
From their perspective, we are all born as Muslims. And it is our religious traditions that cause us to become unbelievers, that pervert that original Islamic faith. We all are born believing in the one true God, Allah, and it is only later in our training that we imbibe these false ideas.
Furthermore, all Islam shares one common goal.
Since the ultimate fulfillment of Allah's will for the world is that all men be subject to him, then the ultimate desire from the Islamic perspective is the establishment of the Ummah, the Islamic community all around the world.
In Islam, there are no distinction between the state and religion. It says in Arabic, Al-Islamu dinun wa dawla. Islam is a religion and a state. And that's a major concept that non-Muslims should understand. The state and religion are the same. The head of the state is the head of the religion, and vice versa.
In a sense, Christians believe that Christ will establish his kingdom over his world. And Muslims believe that Allah will establish his through Sharia law. But there's one huge difference between the two. Christ does this by changing the heart. Not by external compulsion, but by changing the heart so that my subjection to him is one that flows from the love of my heart, not from any other source.
Well, there you have that. Those fellows are much more knowledgeable in Islam and Hadith and the Quran and all of that than I am. I'm afraid I'm a poor teacher because I don't have that background. I've been trying to get it though for a couple of years now, and I hope that I hope that you will inform yourself. Now, there's a program that's right here on Channel 12 on Monday at 5, I think it is. Very interesting program. I had occasion to watch it this last Monday. It's this fellow is, oh, I had this stuff right in front of me. Dr. Daniel Hummel. Hummel, like the the little figurines, the German figurines. Hummel, I guess, is a German name. And I'm interested now. Dr. Hummel, I went through his curriculum vitae, and he's got some bona fides. He's a professor, an associate professor of political science at ISU. I don't know if he talked to them about his Muslim theology or whatever when they hired him. I don't know if he teaches his beliefs at school. I'm not one of his students, but he is an apologist, a Muslim apologist, and he has a half an hour program. I watched episode 5, and you can look him up and Google him, Dr. Hummel. He's not trying to hide the fact that he's a professor. It doesn't tell you a thing about him. We have no idea who he is. All we know is that he has this curriculum vitae, and interestingly, his discipline was in public administration, among other things, but not in Islam per se. Among other things also, he taught English as a second language. Now, I don't know if he speaks Arabic. He uses Arabic words when he's teaching. But I have to take issue with some of the things he's doing, or some of the things he's saying. And this is not an attack on Dr. Hummel. It's not meant that way at all. It is perhaps the other side of the coin on what he's teaching in his half-hour program. And he gives you, for instance, this last time, he said that there's a mistake as to what Sharia is. And he corrected those people who might say Sharia law, because the word Sharia means law. When you say Sharia law, you're saying law. And he kind of corrected a few other words that are misused by Westerners. So what? But he did make some interesting points. But he puts them in such a way that it's much more attractive than it is in reality. He explains, he says that Sharia is a way of life. Indeed it is. It is the way of life for every obedient Muslim. And as you saw in the film just a few moments ago, Muslim literally does not go to the bathroom without following Sharia. That's literal. I'm not using that as a play on words. They literally have a specific way in which they are to cleanse themselves. One of the things in the Muslim world is the right hand is not used for anything except eating and shaking hands. If you are Muslim and you shake hands with your left hand, you have insulted the person that you just shook hands with, because your left hand is to be used for those things that are not clean. I'll just leave it at that. Many of these little things, but Sharia dictates the very existence from sunup to sundown and everything in between for every obedient Muslim. Now, according to Dr. Hummel, the Muslims in this nation are not trying to supplant the Constitution with Sharia. Well, that sounds good, except that it's such convoluted logic, because a good Muslim must live according to Sharia, and Sharia does not allow competition from any other governmental form. So in these little, like they have in outside of Paris, the banlieues, where they have, I don't know how many of these banlieues there are, where the people are French. Now they have generations who were born in France, but they give all of their loyalty to the Quran, to Islam, and Sharia, and they are self-contained within the area around Paris. That's not unlike what's happening around Dearborn, Michigan. And it's going to happen elsewhere if we allow it. We've already had a couple of judges who should be immediately removed from the bench, in my opinion, who have allowed Sharia to supersede the Constitution in a couple of decisions. Now, I've told you before, and I believe this truly, in my opinion, Islam, the Hadiths, however you want to do it, Islam and Sharia, I think that these are contrary to the best interests of our nation, and that they should be treated as enemies of the state, just like communism was. Now, that's pretty out there. I understand that. It's never going to happen. Certainly not with Barry Soetoro as the President of the United States. And you may wonder, we've talked about this before, some people say, well, why is he always defending Islam? Why will he not admit that we're at war with Islam? Remember, his formative years of education were in the madrasas in Indonesia. He is a Muslim. Regardless of what he tells you, his thinking is Muslim. And just, I was raised a Catholic. There are still things that I was taught as a boy, as a Catholic, in catechism and my training, that I still, after all these years, and I have been a Lutheran for 45 years, I still think in terms that I have to kind of redirect my thinking as I did as a Catholic. It is not, to this very day, when I enter the aisle at church, if I'm on the aisle with the altar, I am tempted to genuflect before I enter into the pews, which is what I was taught as a Catholic boy. As a Catholic boy, I was taught to cross myself whenever I passed a Catholic church. To this day, I have that urge. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying you get certain things in your psyche that don't leave you. Well, remember, Barry Soetoro, also known as Muhammad or Barack Obama, was educated in his formative years in the madrasas. In the madrasas, you study for 6, 8, whatever it is, hours per day, and all you do in a madrasa is memorize the Quran. That's it. You're not taught anything else. You don't learn to read, write, other than what you need to read for the Quran. You're not taught science. Science is prohibited in the purest sense of Islam. You're not taught to add and subtract. You are taught Islam. Now, if you're doing that for all of your formative years, no matter how you walk away from it, it's there forever. I remember they made a big deal about how he was a Christian and he went to that church in the Chicago Heights or wherever it was he was from. And gosh, the name of that raving lunatic that was the minister at that church, still is, I guess, eludes me. But that raving lunatic, who's the minister of that particular church, and it's a pretty big congregation, he's a convert from Muslim. Is he a convert? I don't think so. You have to think back of the word I've taught you before and look it up, taqiyya. I can't tell you the correct spelling, T-A-C-Q-Y-Y-A, I think it is taqiyya, or Y-Y-I-A. Taqiyya is a concept, a precept, if you will, in the Quran that requires Muslims to lie when it serves the purpose of Islam, whether it's to protect themselves because they're outnumbered. You remember when Muhammad made war on the Quraysh, when he went to their town and tried to proselytize them, and they drove him out, so to speak. They treated him badly. He went back where he'd come from, gathered an army, and went back and slaughtered them. That's how you spread Islam in that time. That's not changing much today. Now there's a passage in here. Getting back to Dr. Hummel, and I wonder if, I don't know if he seems, I think he has declared himself a Muslim. I'm wondering why he's still using a Christian name if he's a Muslim. Why hasn't he taken, like Muhammad Ali, formerly known as Cassius Clay, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was, what the heck was his name before? Lou Alcindor. When they converted to Islam, and their version of Islam was under the Nation of Islam, black Muslim thing, originally, they took a Muslim name. So I don't know if Dr. Hummel is a Muslim. He was, I guess he may have stepped down, I'm not sure, but he was the Secretary General for the Southeastern Muslim Association, which covers about 80 square miles. And that's you can see that on the internet. But he is the apologist. He is the one who comes on television and speaks to the newspapers and then to anybody who will listen about the virtues of Islam, and tries to downplay it, make it a very peaceful, sweet, loving existence. And all those horrible things you've heard, well, that was because those nasty Christians and Jews did certain things that had to be overcome. Don't buy into it. Anything he says or I say, look it up. Don't take Ralph Lillig's word for it. Look it up. And there are many places you can go that's easy to read. I'm going to read you something out of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam by Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer is one of the foremost writers on things Islamic. He knows Islam very well. And, now you hear the term, oftentimes you hear the word moderate Islam. One of the best definitions I've ever heard for a moderate Muslim, the radical Muslim is the guy who cuts off your head. The moderate is the guy who holds your feet. There isn't a far stretch between them. But taqiyya, protect yourself and protect the faith. There are some Muslims who are working to bring about change within Islam. Islam, unless there is a reformation within Islam like there was in the Christian faith, Islam is not going to change. The problem is, in the Christian faith, there was room to have a reformation. In Islam, there is none, because the Quran says that if you speak out against it, you have to die. There is no in-between. You're not allowed to discuss it. You have to die. So those who speak out against the extremes things we're seeing today, they are literally putting their lives at risk. Dr. Zuji, I forget his name. You see him on Fox a lot. Nice-looking young man. I guess he's pretty close to 50. Medical doctor. He was a commander in the United States Navy. He is a devout Muslim, but he is not a radical nut job. And he speaks out against the nut jobs a lot, and his life is in danger. And it takes a tremendous amount of courage to speak out against Islam as is practiced today in many areas, because when you do, you're supposed to die. Let me go back to what I was saying here. So this is from the book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades. And boy, that's a study all by itself, the Crusades, by Robert Spencer. And he says, of course, there are some Muslims who are working to bring about change within Islam, but it is difficult to discern their motives. The prominent American Muslim spokesman, Siraj Wahhaj, for instance, is often presented as a moderate. In 1991, he even became the first Muslim to give an invocation to the U.S. Congress. And why not? Long after the September 11th attacks, he said just what jittery Americans wanted to hear from Muslims. I now feel responsible to preach, actually to go on jihad against extremism. And that word jihad has been used and abused a lot, but it is not in its context, in the traditional Quranic context, it is not peaceful. It is war. All right? So he wants to go on jihad against extremism. Whether his true thoughts are more extreme remains unclear. After all, he has also warned the United States will fall. And now, pay attention to this. This guy who spoke, gave an invocation before our Congress, warned that the United States will fall unless it accepts Islam, the Islamic agenda. He has lamented that if only Muslims were clever politically, they could take over the United States and replace its constitutional government with a caliphate. And that, dear friends, is the bottom line. That's the end game. That's what their intent is, to do away with all of the religions of the world, all of the governments of the world, and especially the big Satan, as they call us. Satan is the same word in Islam as we use, Satan, Satan. The definition is a little different, but it's pretty much, I mean, it's the same evil thing. And we are called by the extremists, or whatever you want to call them, we are the great Satan. And wouldn't it be amazing? You know, they've called the Pope satanic. If a Christian calls Muhammad satanic, he's due to die. Very interesting differences of way of looking at things. All right. The fact that someone who would like to see the Constitution replaced has led a prayer for those sworn to uphold it is just a symptom of a larger ongoing problem. The government and media are eager to find moderate Muslims, and as their desperation has increased, their standards have declined. This moderate Islam does not exist to any significant extent in the world today. Where Muslims do coexist peacefully with non-Muslims, as in Central Asia and elsewhere, it is not because the teachings of jihad have been reformed or rejected. They have simply been ignored. And history teaches us that they can be remembered at any time. The politically incorrect guide to Islam and the Crusades. You need to watch that. All right, we've got another short film to show you. Now, this one doesn't have us speaking, talking head like I'm a talking head. It's strictly written, so you'll have to pay attention, watch the screen, but it does have a narration. But this is important. Josh, are we ready on that next one? Okay, please watch this.
For every opinion or belief someone may hold, there will be another party who just as strongly oppose that idea. Both sides usually claim to sit with the best arguments, the real facts, and the correct worldview, and ironically, both sides regard the other as being indoctrinated, blind to the obvious and outright stupid. Most people only expose themselves to information that matches their own worldview. It is uncomfortable to do otherwise. Still, we would like to give you some surprising information about Islam. We also urge you to look further than only mainstream media, and if you can find the time for it, read the Quran yourself. To get you started, we'd like to present you 3 things you probably did not know about Islam. 1. Islam has not been hijacked. That Islam has been hijacked is what non-Muslims naturally assume, because they assume all religions are the same. The reason non-Muslims are so easily confused is that most of us don't realize the difference between the Quran and every other religious book we are familiar with. The Christian Bible is a collection of writings from various authors, written sometimes hundreds of years apart, with parables, advice and dreams, all collected together into one book. Same with the Jewish Torah. Even those of us in the West, who are neither Christians nor Jews, are still familiar enough with these religions to know this much, and therefore we assume the same is true for the Quran. But the Quran is only one book written by one man in his own lifetime. It is meant to be taken literally, and it is not full of symbolism or vague analogies. It is mostly direct commands. Of course, the Quran contains contradictory statements, just like other religious books. But the Quran itself provides the reader with a way to know what to do with the contradictions. It's explained in the Quran that if you have 2 passages that contradict each other, the one written later supersedes the one written earlier. Most Westerners are unaware that the peaceful, tolerant passages were written early in Muhammad's prophetic career. According to the Quran, those passages have been abrogated by later, more violent and less tolerant passages. So, when most Westerners hear jihadists quoting violent passages from the Quran, and then peaceful Muslims quoting peaceful passages, they interpret that the way they would if someone was quoting the Bible or the Torah. They think to themselves, oh, there must be many different and contradictory passages, like there are in other religious books, so Muslims can pick and choose what they like and justify whatever actions they want to take. But the Quran is nothing like that. There is no picking and choosing. It says very explicitly and in no uncertain terms that a Muslim must not alter or ignore any part of its very clear and direct message, or they will burn in a fiery torment forever. Two. Striving to institute worldwide Sharia law is a religious duty. Many people don't realize how politically oriented Islam is at its core. In fact, Islam is less of a religion than it is a religious ideology. It includes a mandatory and highly specific legal and political plan for the whole society, Sharia. There is no separation between the religious and the political in Islam. Rather, Islam and Sharia constitute a totalitarian means of ordering society at every level, including ritual worship, transactions and contracts, morals and manners, beliefs and punishments. In the Quran, Allah makes it clear that man-made governments, such as a democracy, and free speech, such as criticizing the Quran, are abominations and must be eliminated. The modern expression creeping Sharia is used to describe the slow, deliberate and methodical advance of Islamic law in non-Muslim countries. Official Sharia courts already operate in the UK, handling cases ranging from divorce and financial disputes to domestic violence. Attempts to introduce Sharia in the legal system in Germany, Sweden and other European countries are ongoing. While Sharia already has a foot in our door in the matter of minor disputes like inheritance and domestic violence, it should concern you that Sharia commands that drinkers and gamblers should be whipped, allows husbands to hit their wives, allows an injured plaintiff to exact legal revenge, literally an eye for an eye, commands that a thief must have a hand cut off, commands that homosexuals must be executed, orders unmarried fornicators to be whipped and adulterers to be stoned to death, orders death for both Muslim and non-Muslim critics of Muhammad, the Quran and even Sharia itself, orders apostates to be killed, commands offensive, aggressive and unjust jihad. As written in the Quran, Sharia is the law of Allah. Any other form of government is a sin. It is the duty of every Muslim to keep striving until all governments have been converted to Sharia law. Three. Muslims are allowed to deceive non-Muslims if it helps Islam. For non-Muslims, this principle, called taqiyya, is another surprising concept of Islam. While most other religions speak highly of truthfulness, the Quran instructs Muslims to lie to non-Muslims about their beliefs and their political ambitions to protect and spread Islam. There are many examples of today's Islamic leaders saying one thing in English for the Western press and then saying something entirely different to their own followers in Arabic a few days later. Deceiving the enemy is always useful in war, and Islam is at war with a non-Islamic world until the whole world follows Sharia law. All non-Muslims living in non-Islamic states are therefore enemies. So deceiving Westerners is totally acceptable, even encouraged, if it can forward the goals of the spread of Islam. As a recent example, the Islamic American Relief Agency were seemingly raising money for orphans, but in fact giving the money to terrorists. They deceived good-hearted Western infidels into giving money to organizations that were actively killing Western infidels. Do the research yourself. This is not an isolated case. Islam as a religion of peace. Muslim organizations worldwide often declare that Islam is a religion of peace. But what does that really mean? It seems easy for a Muslim to quote a peaceful verse from the early parts of the Quran, while, by following the principle of taqiyya, neglecting to mention the fact that it has been officially abrogated by later, more violent verses. According to the Quran, the world will be at peace only when Islam and Sharia reign in every country, and never until then. This is why every Muslim can truthfully say that Islam is a religion of peace. If any of these points took you by surprise, then there is surely much more you still don't know. This subject will affect you in the near future, so take the chance to inform yourself now before it does.
It's an interesting accent. I can't tell if that's if that has been mechanically engineered by computer, or if that's, it sounds rather Dutch, kind of French, I don't know, maybe Flemish, somewhere in between there. I told you about this Dr. Hummel, who is the local apologist for Islam. He got his PhD at Florida Atlantic University, University of Nebraska, got an MA in the College of Public Affairs and Community Service, School of Public Administration. His PhD is in School of Public Administration. Got a BA in International Politics from Pennsylvania State University. Teaching interests, urban studies, community planning, democracy and government, public budgeting and finance, organization theory, public policy and strategic planning, a number of honors and awards. He has peer-reviewed articles that he's published, has some under review, teaches at the university. Now, I was told that he taught in social studies in the department, maybe it's under that department, but he teaches financial administration and budgeting, graduate and undergraduate, community and regional planning, graduate and undergraduate, face-to-face online, intergovernmental relations, graduate and undergovernment, state and local government, undergraduate, political research methods with lab, graduate and undergraduate, and introduction to U.S. government. For a guy who touts Sharia, that's interesting. Undergraduate. So, as I said, I'm not. This is not meant. He has an impressive curriculum vitae, and it's not meant to bum rap him. But if he's going to apologize for Islam, then I will hold him accountable for telling the truth and not shading it with feel-good stuff. Now, part of what got this whole thing going tonight was an interesting thing that happened at my house today. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, doorbell rang, and there's a fellow, he rang the doorbell a number of times, and I guess nobody answered quickly enough. And I was downstairs, and so I got upstairs and caught him just as he was leaving, and I asked him what he wanted. He turned around, and then I recognized him as one of the Muslims that used to live across the street from us, illegally renting a house. There were a bunch of Muslim students who were renting a house illegally in our residential neighborhood. They cannot rent a house and make it into a frat house or a mosque or anything like that. But they used to have Friday night their worship services, and they'd have their friends over, and I guess they trashed the house. Now, the people who owned the house were neighbors. They lived here. They've now moved to a different city, and the woman was a school teacher here, and her husband did other work. We had been friends. We had no problem with them, but they were acting very irresponsibly with this property. And so finally one night when it got out of hand, I finally called them, and the first words out of the woman's mouth, a woman who I thought was a friend, first thing she said was, "That's because you're a racist." I almost fell over backwards because it had nothing to do with that. Well, anyway, so this fellow showed up at the doorstep today, and he wanted to know if the house was for rent, and I greeted him in Arabic, "Assalamu alaikum." And he got kind of a funny look on his face, and he asked me if the house was for sale. I said no. And he asked me again if I knew of any place for rent around there. I said no. And then he asked me if I spoke Arabic. I said no. And he left. But I recognized him as being one of the neighbors from a couple of years ago, so a couple of things came to mind. Now, I am sure that of those 2,000 Muslims living here in town, and many of them from Saudi Arabia, which is the heart of Wahhabism, the most virulent form of Islam, I'm sure that they have an unofficial fatwa for me having even had the audacity to speak out about Islam. For any other reason than this, Muhammad bin Jarrah reported that Ibn Abbas said that the Prophet said, whoever explains the Quran with his opinion, and I give you my opinion, or with what he has no knowledge of, then let him assume his seat in the fire. There's that fire thing again. So I saw this young man, I thought, now 2 years ago, roughly 2 years ago, he approached me at that time and asked if the house was for rent or for sale. And now he shows up on my doorstep with the same song and dance. Why? Was he checking to see how I would respond to the door? Surely he didn't forget, since he told me he liked the house, and he told me again today that he liked the house. I'm certain he recognized me. Why was he there? Very interesting. Remember I told you that I'm sure there are ISIS sleeper cells here, probably even right here in good old Pocatello? Maybe so. Here's a little quick review of Muslim USA history. 732 AD, the Muslim army, which was moving on Paris, was defeated and turned back at Tours, France, by Charles Martel. 1571 AD, the Muslim army and navy was defeated by the Italians and Austrians as they tried to cross the Mediterranean to attack southern Europe in the Battle of Lepanto. 1683 AD, the Turkish Muslim army attacking Eastern Europe was finally defeated in the Battle of Vienna by German and Polish Christian armies. This stuff's been going on for 1,400 years, and half our politicians don't even know it. If these battles had not been won, we might be speaking Arabic, and Christianity would be non-existent. Judaism certainly would be. And let us not forget that Hitler was an admirer of Islam, and that the Mufti of Jerusalem was Hitler's guest in Berlin and raised Bosnian Muslim SS divisions, the 13th and 21st Waffen SS divisions, who killed Jews, Russians, Gypsies, and other subhumans. We've got about 2 minutes. There are other things, so many other things I wanted to talk about, but with that little time, let me just run this by you once again, as I did once before. This is from an individual who worked in Saudi Arabia for 20 years. I see we're on the 1 minute mark. We're going to do this again next week. I'm going to keep teaching you about Islam. I'll try not to make it a whole program every week, but you know, forewarned is forearmed. Ladies and gentlemen, the darkness of the 7th century is descending upon the world. And if we're not going to think about it, if we want to just hide our heads in the sand, that darkness will overwhelm us. Judeo-Christian thought, the Western way of life, will cease to exist. Arm yourselves, be prepared, arm yourselves mentally. In the meantime, God bless and keep you. Hope we have you here again next week, same time and same station. Do your homework, and we'll see you again. God bless you. Good night.